The signal came in on a frequency so old, I had to pull it from the tertiary archive just to confirm the wavelength existed. I have worked the Solon Sentinel relay for 11 years. My post sits at the outer boundary of the Sol approach corridor, a station no wider than 3 city blocks, mounted on a spar of Kalahari composite that was already 400,000 years old when my grandmother was born. My job is to listen. Everything that crosses the threshold of this system, every whisper of directed energy across the electromagnetic range, arrives at this relay before it reaches Earth. I catalog it, classify it, and route it to the appropriate authority on the surface. In 11 years, I had flagged 49 items of note: relic navigation pings from dead survey drones, collapsed frequency echoes from old colony ships, twice a distress beacon from deep-range freight. Quiet work. I did not mind quiet work. The signal came in at 0312 station time, on a day I had spent calibrating the deep-range array. It was narrow-band, directed, purposeful, aimed at a specific coordinate, not this station, not any installation I could identify, aimed at the planet, at Earth herself. I ran the frequency match. The tertiary archive is not a system I access often. It holds pre-contact records, pre-expansion records, records so old that the archivists who built it used notation systems that required a translation layer to read. The match came back in 40 seconds. Sorreth, cognitive lattice. Activation frequency, primary band. I sat with that for a moment. The Sorreth seeded the cognitive lattice into Earth's biological substrate, 820,000 years ago. I had read about it, the way one reads about a thing so distant it has the quality of a myth. The lattice was a distributed architecture, a mesh of engineered molecular relays, each one smaller than a cell, threaded into the nervous tissue of every living creature on the planet's surface. The Sorreth had done this on dozens of worlds. The architecture was designed to lie dormant until they returned and broadcast the activation frequency, at which point every biological mind in range would become a node in the Sorreth cognitive network, conscious, aware, and no longer sovereign. The records say humanity found the first relay threads 11 years after seeding, found them the way you find something when you are not yet sure what you are looking for, by noticing that the tissue samples did not behave the way tissue samples were supposed to behave. The Kalahari Research Foundation spent 200 years studying them before they understood the design well enough to begin modifying it. They did not destroy it. That is the thing a person must sit with when they read the history. They could have burned it out, engineered a counteragent, scrubbed the lattice from human tissue entirely. The Foundation debated that option for 60 years. Then they chose the other one. They ran it. Not as the Sorreth designed it, as something else entirely. The Kalahari cognitive grid came online in year 241 of the Foundation's work. Not a cage, not a control network, a commons. Every human mind that chose to participate contributed a portion of its processing architecture to a distributed whole, and drew from the whole in return. Navigation calculations that would take a single mind a year were resolved in seconds. Medical diagnoses, engineering tolerances for the megastructures, translation matrices for 800 alien language families. The grid ran all of it, quietly, through the same molecular relay architecture the Sorreth had planted in our nervous tissue to enslave us. By the time the Foundation's third generation of engineers had finished their work, the boundary between the lattice and human cognition was no longer a boundary. It was a gradient. You did not log in to the grid. You were the grid, and it was you. And the distinction that the Sorreth had relied upon, the separation between the cage and the caged, had dissolved so completely that there was nothing left to activate against. The grid had been running for 819,760 years. I looked at the signal on my display and understood, in that moment, what the Sorreth vessel crossing the Sol approach corridor was about to find out. I had 40 minutes before the signal reached Earth. The grid would parse it the instant it arrived. The activation command would propagate across the full architecture. 820,000 years of relay threads, threaded through 47 settled systems, and 112 billion individual minds. And it would find nothing to seize, because there was nothing separate from it. The grid would recognize the command, log it, classify it, and do nothing, because the minds it was designed to subordinate had already incorporated the architecture of their own subordination into the foundation of their civilization. But the Sorreth vessel was still crossing the threshold, still coming, and the grid's response would be invisible to them, a silence they might read as lag, as error, as something that required them to close the distance and investigate. I did not want them to close the distance. I opened a transmission window on the Sorreth activation frequency. This took me 6 minutes. The frequency was so archaic that my station's transmitter required a manual reconfiguration I had never performed before, working from a procedure document in the tertiary archive written in notation I could barely parse. My hands were steady. I am not a person who is given to ceremony, but I understood, in those 6 minutes, that I was holding something the Foundation had held for 800,000 years. The specific patience required to do the work in front of you, when the work in front of you is the only answer available. I assembled the transmission packet. The Kelhari cognitive grid maintains a continuous operational archive. Every calculation run through the grid since its activation in year 241 is logged, time-stamped, and stored. The archive is 412 exabytes. It contains 819,000 years of human thought, navigation solutions, medical decisions, engineering judgments, diplomatic exchanges, grief, mathematics, music theory, the weight calculations for the second Thyron orbital ring, the last words of a man named Solon Darath filed into the grid at the moment of his death, because he had been thinking about his granddaughter, and the grid held all of it. Every mind that ever ran through that architecture is in there, compressed, indexed, and retrievable. I transmitted the full archive on the Sorreth activation frequency. It took 9 minutes to push 412 exabytes through a reconfigured transmitter on a 3-block station at the edge of the Sol boundary. I watched the progress indicator. I thought about what I was sending. Not data, not a legal argument, not a warning in any form the Sorreth Cognitive Authority would have a charter provision to answer. I was sending them the contents of every human mind that had ever lived through 820,000 years of a civilization built on the bones of what they planted in us. The Sorreth vessel went silent for 11 minutes after the transmission completed. Then it turned around. No acknowledgement, no countersignature, no diplomatic reply. It simply ceased its approach, reoriented on a heading away from the Sol system, and accelerated out of the approach corridor at a rate that suggested something close to urgency. I tracked it until it left my sensor range. I did not transmit again. I filed the intercept report at 0511 station time and routed it to the Planetary Signal Authority on the surface. The grid would have the full record already: the incoming activation signal, my transmission, the Sorreth vessel's departure vector. Someone on Earth would read my report and open the appropriate follow-on files. That was not my job. My job was to listen, and I had listened, and the thing I had heard had required an answer, and I had given the only one available. I have thought, in the weeks since, about what the Sorreth vessel's crew saw when they opened that archive. Whether they found what I intended them to find. Whether that is even the right word. Intended. I did not plan that transmission in any tactical sense. There was no doctrine that covered it. I simply understood, in the 6 minutes I spent reconfiguring the transmitter, that the correct answer to a species that planted a cage in your nervous tissue and returned 820,000 years later to close it was to show them, without commentary, what had lived inside the cage in the meantime. If they came back to claim a tool, they needed to know what the tool had become. And if they came back again after that, if there was another vessel, another signal, another activation attempt across whatever distance separated us from whatever remained of the Sorreth Cognitive Authority's reach, then the grid would answer in its own way, at its own scale, with the full weight of 820,000 years of a civilization that had been thinking, quietly and without interruption, since before most of the stars visible from this relay had finished forming. I recalibrated the deep range array. I logged the event in the tertiary archive, in the notation the archive used, because that is where the record belonged. I returned to listening,